One of the key questions that business leaders are asking these days is what are the implications of a Biden administration for U.S.-China relations? The U.S. and China are the two world's largest economies, and yet the last 4 years have seen a rejection by the U.S. under President Trump of the idea that through more gradual, gentle pressures, China would enact political and economic reforms, and instead took a much more aggressive and unilateral approach to enacting tariffs, sanctions, and other actions that became termed as a trade war between these two large countries. A fair question to ask is whether a Biden administration will represent a return to the policies of Obama and earlier U.S. presidents. And the short answer is no, most likely not. Although the approach likely will be quite different than the one taken over the last 4 years, especially in recent years, there's become an emerging and bipartisan consensus and criticism of China over some critical issues. First would be concerns over kind of forced technology transfer and in some cases even theft and cyber theft. The second has to do with issues of subsidies provided by the Chinese government or other influence and interference by the Chinese government that the U.S. and other countries deem unfair. And the third has to do with the variety of human rights issues relating to the Security Act that was enacted in Hong Kong, the repression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, that have led to really both sides of the aisle in the U.S. Being critical of China on a number of issues. So what will Biden's approach look like? One of the key areas I expect him to focus on is a return to multilateralism. A number of the U.S.'s traditional allies, the European Union, Canada, Australia, Japan, have felt that the relationship has frayed, to put it mildly, over the past 4 years. And I expect Biden to work to repair and re-engage some of our traditional allies in order to provide more of a united front against China rather than going it alone. One challenge that Biden will face is that China over the past few years has worked to build its own connections with some of the U.S.'s key allies in a bid to try and weaken some of the influence that the U.S. has over some of its traditional allies. A second key area where I expect Biden to focus is in really trying to, I guess, add a little bit more nuance in the sense that whereas I think the Trump administration tended to see everything that was China or Chinese as inherently bad or in a zero-sum context, I expect the Biden administration to look for areas, if not for cooperation, at least coordination, where there are mutual interests at play. So trying to distribute the COVID vaccine and fight COVID, areas relating to climate change, where there might be opportunities for the two countries to, again, at least coordinate, if not cooperate. Other arenas will still likely be areas for competition, but I expect there to be greater nuance and the end of the diplomacy by tweet approach that was taken over the last 4 years. And I don't say that lightly. Foreign policy is one area where a president has incredible unilateral power compared to domestic issues where the president must work with Congress. And so I expect Biden to take a different approach, not just in substance, but also in tone as well. So what does this mean for business? One of the first and most important questions has to do with the tariffs that are currently in place on Chinese goods that are being brought into the United States, which essentially represent a large tax that needs to be paid by U.S. Companies or individuals in order to bring these goods into the country. I expect these tariffs to remain in place for the most part, at least in the short to medium term. Rather than simply removing these tariffs in some kind of bid to try and improve relations with China, I expect the Biden administration to use them as more of a bargaining tool to try to negotiate and say, okay, if these steps relating to some of the concerns about technology transfer subsidies are addressed, then the tariffs will be eased or removed. One other area that I think will affect business has to do with issues relating to people. So the Trump administration was rather aggressive about curtailing visas for both skilled and unskilled workers. And I would bet that the Biden administration will ease a number of those restrictions. So I would imagine it would be a lot easier for, again, there are a large number of Chinese undergraduate students, graduate students, employees in a variety of sectors, including technology sector. I would imagine that under Biden it will be easier for those individuals to remain in the U.S., work in the U.S., and for U.S. companies to employ those individuals. A third area that I think will impact business a lot is this battle of multilateralism that I alluded to earlier, where rather than kind of this one-on-one mono fight between the U.S. and China, China has been establishing economic relations, both bilateral as well as multilateral, and I expect the U.S. to re-engage as well on that front. And I think for businesses overall, this is a positive development as trade restrictions, not just directly between the U.S. and China, but between, say, China and Europe, or the U.S. and its traditional allies, will become a little bit more frictionless. However, I imagine this will create some winners and losers. I think for a number of, especially say smaller firms or less multinational firms, might find it harder to take advantage of some of these multilateral deals as opposed to a larger multinational who could have their European subsidiary engage with China on their behalf. Purely domestic U.S. firm might not be able to do that. As a final note, I think it's important to keep in mind that when Biden takes office, he will be becoming president in the midst of obviously a terrible pandemic. There is much economic and political strife in the United States right now. And most likely these issues relating to China, while they are obviously important, they will probably not be number one or even number two on his agenda. So I imagine that many of these issues will evolve over time. Both countries will probably try and feel each other out and try and get a sense for, again, what are areas for cooperation? What are areas where the level of competition will still remain high? But this is definitely going to be a medium to long-term issue. And a number of these changes that I talked about won't happen immediately. They will take some time to play out.